Hello, this is Anthony Hamilton with the ex-ABC support group. We wanted to take this time to talk about the biggest boogeyman in G. Craige Lewis's closet, and that is the infamous Jezebel. It is no secret that G. Craige Lewis has dug his heels in on many doctrinal stances involving his interpretation of the infamous Jezebel, wife of King Ahab. I'm sure you all remember G. Craige Lewis referring to Ahab as being the wackest man to ever live. So if you were a single man in G. Craige Lewis's church and you stayed single for too long, you were considered to be a weak man and maybe referred to as an Ahab. If you were a husband and you had problems in your home for one reason or another, especially if you seem to have problems keeping your wife in check, G. Craige Lewis will refer to this type of man as an Ahab or maybe even a beta male. If you didn't know, these two terms are synonymous to G. Craige Lewis. If you were a married woman and you disagreed with your husband, or most importantly, G. Craige Lewis, you were referred to as being a Jezebel. If you were a single woman who just so happened to reject the man that G. Craige Lewis said you should marry, didn't do what G. Craige Lewis told you to do, or disagreed with G. Craige Lewis, you were, yeah, you guessed it, a Jezebel.
Come on, Jezzy.
Furthermore, in my experience with attending ABC, there seemed to occasionally be women in the congregation that only G. Craige Lewis can see, being that he fancies himself a prophet, that he would call out of the blue, Jezebel.
Come on, Jezzy.
But these unknown women were special kinds of Jezebel. They were Jezebel Witches. You see, G. Craige Lewis believes that there is an actual spirit of Jezebel that possesses women, even Christian women, which causes them, their husband, and their children to do heinous things. G. Craige Lewis has taught in his Truth Behind Hip Hop Part 6 video that Christians can serve two masters, as suggested by his statement that a Christian can have their soul belong to God, but their spirit surrendered to the enemy. So in this case, a Christian woman can have her soul belong to God, but her spirit surrendered to the Jezebel spirit. In other words, instead of this hypothetical Christian woman being among those of us who are temporarily overtaken in a fault of narcissistic behavior by the deceitfulness of sin without being hardened to the point of being an unbeliever, which should be remedied starting with Galatians 6:1, G. Craige Lewis says that this Christian woman serves two masters, having her soul surrendered to God and her spirit surrendered to the Jezebel spirit. Additionally, he believes that if he can keep this Jezebel spirit in check, he wouldn't have to worry about this spirit holding his secrets as ransom over his head and destroying his ministry. Yes, you heard me correctly. This is actually on one of his slides for his video, Jezebel Finest Hour. Now, he mentions this idea in general terms, but we all know that G. Craige Lewis has a lot of secrets.
And we're talking about, I'm here with LaDonna Jackson, those who are just logging in, and she has been very bold and very gracious to reach out and want to talk about her story of healing. But in this portion of our interview and our conversation, rather, there are some things that we have to talk about to get to where we are. And to put things in context, she was involved with G. Craige Lewis. Initially, she was brought in to support and help the ministry. And at some point, one thing led to another, and she was unfortunately involved in a relationship that lasted how long?
It lasted a year, 1 year.
Yeah.
And so it is reasonable to conclude that he is talking about himself. And so occasionally he calls out to this spirit as an attempt to keep it in check.
Come on, Jezzy.
Now, we have already made the argument that the scripture clearly says that it is impossible for any of us to serve two masters, so I won't go into that in an effort to stay on topic. As a result of G. Craige Lewis's Jezebel teachings, we have heard testimonies of women who were traumatized.
I sat on my couch and he came over. He came over my apartment. And I told you this story, Teton. He comes over and he says, God told me to take my hands off of you. And he puts his hand, you know, he carries a gun with him all the time. He puts his hand on his gun, puts his hand, you know, he carries a gun with him all the time. He puts his hand on his gun on his back where he kept his weapon. And he goes, you got to go.
The will of a contentious woman is hard to break. It's hard to break. Hard to break. I wish I could tell you that it can always be broken. Sometimes it can't. Depends on the damage that was done in her upbringing.
Instead of praying for their family, circumstances, church members, leaders in the church, and in the world, these women were set on praying the Jezebel spirit out of themselves. We have heard testimonies of men becoming overbearing with their wives in an attempt to take charge and force this spirit out of their wives and their homes instead of dwelling with their wives with understanding, loving them as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, and honoring her as the weaker vessel. So I think it's important to understand who Ahab was and who Jezebel was from a biblical perspective and not from G. Craige Lewis's machinations.
Come on, Jezzy.
So let's talk about Ahab. Ahab was the son of King Omri. The scripture says in 1 Kings 16:25 that Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord by walking in the way of Jeroboam, who created 2 golden calves for the people of Israel to worship, among many other evil things. So too did King Omri do, as verse 25 says that he provoked the Lord with his idols. So Ahab takes over as king of the northern kingdom in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, in the southern kingdom, and he reigned for 22 years. Verse 30 in the same chapter said that Ahab did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings before him. So the natural question is, what did he do that was so bad? Well, according to the scripture, I see a progression of evil throughout the generations of the kings of Israel, going from bad to worse. But I will make note of 4 main things that the scripture highlights regarding Ahab. Number 1, he married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Number 2, being that his father was an idol worshiper, I would assume that his marriage to Jezebel wasn't the sole source of his treachery, but was definitely a catalyst. His idol worship was so atrocious that he sinned without conscience, as the scripture speaks of those who fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and teaching of demons by the way of the hypocrisy of liars, whose conscience is seared with a hot iron. 1 Timothy 4:1-2. 1 Kings 16:31 describes Ahab's attitude towards his idolatry in a similar manner, saying that he sinned as if it was a trivial thing to him. Number 3, Ahab went to go serve Baal and erected an altar to Baal, not only within the boundaries of the northern kingdom, but in the capital, the ruling city of Israel, Jezreel, within Samaria. 4, Ahab also made the Asherah, which is a wooden symbol of a female deity. Now, the question that we should all be asking is, why was Ahab's behavior particularly bad? Most of the other kings of Israel were idol worshippers, and he was not the only king that took a pagan wife. G. Craige Lewis's answer would be that Ahab didn't have his woman in check.
I wanted to hold on to something. It wasn't lust. It wasn't love. It was that driving. Now I know it's that worship, that God. But it's also that, I don't know if I don't call it brainwash. I would just call it, I was checked.
Come on, Jezzy.
And so he allowed his wife to usurp his authority by incitement, or as the King James Version says, stirred him up. But is this a good interpretation of what happened here? There has been a lot of ink spilled over this question. My purpose is not to interject myself into that debate, but to offer what I believe is a reasonable take on the matter. Let's take a look at what I think is the main problem here and line it up with the actions of King Ahab. Let's go to Exodus 23:31-33. It says, I will set your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates River. For I will hand over the inhabitants of the land to you, and you will drive them out from you. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land. Otherwise, they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it is certain to be a snare to you. Exodus 34, 12 through 16 says this: Be careful that you do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst. Rather, you are to tear down their altars and smash their memorial stones and cut down their Asherim. For you shall not worship any other God, because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Otherwise, you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to their gods. And someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might prostitute themselves with their gods, and cause your sons also to prostitute themselves with their gods. You shall not make for yourself any gods cast in metal. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6 says this: When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to take possession of it, and he drives away many nations from before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God turns them over to you and you defeat them, you shall utterly destroy them. You shall not make a covenant with them, nor be gracious to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me, and they will serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But this is what you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their memorial stones, cut their Asherim to pieces, and burn their carved images in the fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his personal possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth.